The pharmacy was busy that afternoon, with a long line snaking from the counter to the door as people waited to pick up prescriptions and consult with the pharmacists. The air was thick with a quiet tension, the murmur of hushed voices and shuffling feet filling the space as people anxiously checked their watches or scrolled through their phones. At the end of the line stood Tyrone Johnson, a tall black man with a weary expression and a slight limp. Tyrone clutched his prescription in his hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He had just come from the doctor, who had prescribed him pain medication for a persistent back injury that had been plaguing him for weeks. Every step sent sharp jolts of pain through his spine, but he pushed through, determined to get the medication he so desperately needed. As the line inched forward, Tyrone finally found himself at the counter. The pharmacist, a middle-aged man with a stern face and piercing blue eyes, looked up from his computer with a disapproving frown. Tyrone slid his prescription across the counter, offering a polite nod. "I just need this filled, please." The pharmacist picked up the slip of paper, his gaze flicking from the prescription to Tyrone, his expression hardening. He didn't even try to hide the disdain in his eyes as he studied Tyrone from head to toe. "Is this prescription from a doctor?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Yes, sir," Tyrone replied, doing his best to remain calm. "I just came from the clinic. The doctor prescribed it for my back pain." The pharmacist narrowed his eyes, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I see," he said slowly, drawing out the words as if savoring the power he held in that moment. He glanced at the prescription again, his fingers tapping against the counter in a steady rhythm. "I'll need to verify this with the doctor," he said, his tone cold. Tyrone felt a pang of frustration, but he forced himself to stay calm. "That's fine," he said, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. "Take your time." The pharmacist turned and disappeared into the back room, leaving Tyrone standing alone at the counter. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last as Tyrone's patience wore thin. His back throbbed, and he could feel sweat gathering at his brow, but he remained steadfast, determined not to give the man any reason to deny him his medication. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pharmacist returned, his expression colder than ever. "I spoke to the doctor," he said, his voice flat. "But I don't feel comfortable filling this prescription." Tyrone's eyes widened in disbelief. "Excuse me," he said, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. "What do you mean you don't feel comfortable?" The pharmacist met his gaze with a smug smile. "I don't believe you need this medication." "You look fine to me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You can go back to your doctor if you have a problem with it." A wave of anger surged through Tyrone, and he clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been in pain for weeks, and now, after finally getting a prescription, this man was refusing to fill it based on nothing but his own prejudices. "Look, I'm in serious pain," Tyrone said, his voice tight with frustration. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't need this medication." The pharmacist shrugged, his expression indifferent. "That's not my problem," he said coldly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other customers to attend to." Tyrone's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to contain his anger. He wanted to shout, to demand that the pharmacist do his job, but he knew that wouldn't get him anywhere. Taking a deep breath, he turned and walked out of the pharmacy, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. As he stepped outside, a sense of helplessness washed over him. He had come here hoping for relief, but instead, he had been met with nothing but hostility and prejudice. His back throbbed with every step, and he knew he couldn't go on like this much longer. But as he walked down the street, his frustration began to give way to determination. He wasn't going to let this man's hatred keep him from getting the help he needed. He would find a way to get his medication, no matter what it took. The sun was setting as Tyrone walked down the busy street, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He couldn't believe the pharmacist had refused him service, especially after his doctor had specifically prescribed the medication. The ache in his back had grown more intense, a constant reminder of the pain that never seemed to go away. But as much as the pain gnawed at him, it was the humiliation and anger that truly stung. He took a deep breath, trying to clear his head. Tyrone wasn't the kind of man to let anger consume him. He had always believed in keeping his composure and treating others with respect, even when they didn't deserve it. But this was different. He was tired of being treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. As he continued walking, he noticed a small group of people gathered outside a convenience store, talking in low voices. Among them was his old friend Marcus, a former Marine with a powerful presence and an undeniable loyalty to those he cared about. Marcus noticed Tyrone approaching and raised a hand in greeting. "Tyrone." "It's been a minute," Marcus said, his smile warm and genuine. But as he looked more closely at Tyrone's face, the smile faded. "You look rough, man. Everything okay?" Tyrone managed a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not really," he admitted. He hesitated for a moment before telling Marcus about the ordeal at the pharmacy, explaining how the pharmacist had refused to fill his prescription, the cold disdain in the man's eyes unmistakable. Marcus listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. By the time Tyrone finished, Marcus was shaking his head, his jaw clenched tightly. "That's unacceptable," he said, his voice filled with barely contained anger. "He has no right to treat you like that." Tyrone nodded, feeling a sense of relief at having someone on his side. "I don't know what to do," he said quietly. I need that medication. The pain is getting worse, and I can't keep going on like this." Marcus thought for a moment, then his expression shifted to one of determination. "You're not alone in this, Tyrone," he said firmly. "We'll go back to that pharmacy together. I'll make sure he understands that he can't treat people like that, especially not someone like you." Tyrone looked at Marcus, a mix of gratitude and apprehension in his eyes. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he also knew he couldn't handle this on his own. With Marcus by his side, he felt a newfound sense of strength, as if he finally had someone who understood his pain and frustration. The two men made their way back to the pharmacy, their steps quick and purposeful. By the time they reached the door, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the street in shadows. The pharmacy was still open, though the line had dwindled, and the pharmacist was now standing behind the counter, his eyes fixed on his computer. Marcus pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling loudly as they entered. The pharmacist looked up, his expression immediately turning cold as he recognized Tyrone. But this time, Tyrone didn't back down. With Marcus at his side, he felt a surge of courage that he hadn't felt earlier. The pharmacist's eyes flicked to Marcus, taking in his broad shoulders and stern expression. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone made it clear that he wasn't interested in helping at all. Marcus stepped forward, his gaze locked on the pharmacist. "You can help by filling my friend's prescription," he said firmly. "He's been prescribed this medication by a doctor, and it's your job to provide it." The pharmacist sneered, his gaze shifting back to Tyrone. "I told him I wasn't comfortable filling it," he said coldly. "And I'm not going to change my mind just because he brought someone along to intimidate me." Marcus took a deep breath, clearly trying to keep his anger in check. "This isn't about intimidation," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is about doing what's right. My friend is in pain, and you're standing between him and the help he needs. That's not just unprofessional, it's inhumane." The pharmacist scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said defiantly. "If I don't feel comfortable dispensing a medication, that's my right." Marcus clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he took a step closer to the counter. Tyrone could see the tension building, the barely contained anger simmering beneath Marcus's calm exterior. For a moment, he worried that things were about to escalate, but he also knew that Marcus wasn't the kind of man to back down easily. Tyrone placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, trying to defuse the situation. "Let's go, man," he said quietly. "He's not worth it." But Marcus shook his head, his gaze never wavering from the pharmacist. "No, Tyrone," he said firmly. "You deserve respect, and you deserve the help you need. This man needs to understand that he can't treat people like this." The pharmacist rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, turning back to his computer. But before he could dismiss them completely, Marcus leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You may think you're in control here," he said softly, "but that's about to change. I know people, and I know my rights. If you don't do your job, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how you treat your customers. And believe me, they won't be happy about it." The pharmacist hesitated, his confidence wavering as he glanced nervously at Marcus. He could see the determination in Marcus's eyes, the quiet strength that came from a lifetime of standing up for what was right. For a moment, it seemed as though he might reconsider, but then his expression hardened, his pride refusing to let him back down. "You can threaten me all you want," he said with a sneer. "But I'm not filling that prescription. Now, if you don't leave, I'll call the police." Tyrone's heart sank as he realized that they had reached an impasse. He had hoped that with Marcus's help, they could convince the pharmacist to do his job, but it was clear that the man's prejudice ran too deep. As they turned to leave, Tyrone felt a mix of anger and despair, wondering how much longer he would have to endure this pain and humiliation. Stepping out of the pharmacy, Tyrone and Marcus found themselves in silence, both bristling with anger and frustration. The encounter had taken a toll on Tyrone, who now leaned against the wall, clutching his back as the pain flared up with every breath. Marcus's jaw remained clenched, his fists still balled at his sides. "I don't know how you stayed that calm in there, Tyrone," Marcus muttered, running a hand over his shaved head. "That guy had no right to deny you." Tyrone sighed, pushing himself off the wall. "It's not the first time I've been treated like that, you know," he said, his voice tinged with a bitter resignation. "But I thought, just maybe, things would go differently today." Marcus looked at him, his expression hardening with determination. "Then let's find someone who will help," he said. "There has to be another way." Tyrone shrugged, doubtful. "I don't know, man. That's the only pharmacy close enough to walk to. My car's still in the shop, and I don't think I can make it much farther." Marcus frowned, thinking hard. "I know a friend who owns a car repair shop nearby," he said after a moment. "Maybe he can loan us a car. And if we have to, we'll drive across town to find a pharmacy that's willing to treat you with respect." Tyrone's eyes lit up at the idea. He felt a spark of hope rise within him. "You think your friend would really help us?" Marcus nodded firmly. "He's a good guy. Besides, he owes me a favor," he added with a sly grin. Together, they set off down the block, making their way to the auto shop Marcus had mentioned. Tyrone could feel the strain in his back growing with every step, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward, determined to make it through this night. When they finally reached the shop, they were greeted by the sound of clanging metal and the faint smell of engine oil. Marcus's friend, Jimmy, was underneath a car, tightening bolts with the kind of focused precision that only came from years of experience. Marcus called out to him, and Jimmy rolled out from under the car, grinning as he wiped his hands on a rag. "Marcus," he said with a laugh, clapping his friend on the back. "What brings you by this late?" Marcus explained the situation, and Jimmy listened with a frown, shaking his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "That pharmacist has no right to deny someone their medication just because he's got some twisted ideas." He tossed the rag onto his workbench and gestured toward a rusty old sedan parked in the corner. "You can take that one," he said. "It's not much to look at, but it'll get you where you need to go." Marcus patted Jimmy on the back, grateful. "You're a lifesaver, Jimmy." Jimmy nodded, handing Marcus the keys. "Take care of yourselves." And Tyrone, he added, turning to him with a kind smile, I hope you get the help you need. Tyrone nodded, grateful beyond words. Thank you, Jimmy. I won't forget this. They climbed into the car, and Marcus started the engine, the old vehicle rumbling to life. Tyrone felt a sense of relief settle over him as they pulled out of the shop and headed down the street. He knew there was still a long journey ahead, but for the first time all day, he felt like he had a real chance at finding the help he needed. As they drove, Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his expression one of grim determination. We're not giving up, Tyrone, he said, his voice firm. We're going to find someone who'll treat you with respect and get you that medication. They soon arrived at a 24-hour pharmacy on the other side of town, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the empty parking lot. Tyrone felt his heart race as they approached the entrance, hoping that this time, things would go differently. Inside, the pharmacy was quiet, the aisles deserted. A young woman stood behind the counter, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her computer screen. She looked up as they approached, offering a polite smile. Good evening, she greeted them warmly. How can I help you? Tyrone felt a flicker of hope at her kind demeanor, but he knew better than to let his guard down just yet. He handed her the prescription, watching closely as she examined it. Her face remained neutral as she looked over the paperwork, and for a moment, he allowed himself to hope. But just as she was about to type something into the computer, her expression changed. She glanced at Tyrone, her face clouded with a hint of doubt. I'm sorry, she said, her voice hesitant, but I need to check with the pharmacist about this. Tyrone's heart sank as she disappeared into the back, leaving him and Marcus alone at the counter. He could feel the frustration building inside him, his patience wearing thin. He had been through enough for one night, and he didn't know how much more he could take. Minutes passed, and the young woman finally returned, her expression apologetic. I'm really sorry, she said softly, but the pharmacist isn't comfortable filling this prescription. Tyrone's shoulders slumped as he realized he was back at square one. Can you tell me why? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. It's just, the pharmacist doesn't feel it's appropriate to dispense this medication. He said you'll need to go back to your doctor. Tyrone felt a wave of anger rise within him, but before he could respond, Marcus stepped forward, his expression fierce. This is unbelievable, he said, his voice low and dangerous. This man is in pain. He has a valid prescription. What gives your pharmacist the right to deny him the medication he needs? The young woman looked down, clearly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. There's nothing I can do. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but Tyrone placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Let it go, man, he said, his voice weary. It's not worth it. They turned and walked out of the pharmacy, the weight of defeat heavy on their shoulders. Tyrone's back throbbed with every step, and he felt a sense of despair settle over him, wondering if he would ever find relief from this relentless pain. As they climbed back into the car, Marcus slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his frustration boiling over. I can't believe this is happening, he muttered, his voice filled with anger. How many times do we have to go through this? Tyrone looked out the window, his expression hollow. He had been hopeful for a moment, but now he felt that hope slipping away, replaced by a cold, bitter resignation. The world seemed to have turned against him, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep fighting. As Marcus drove through the empty streets, the hum of the car's engine the only sound between them, Tyrone leaned back in his seat, gripping his side as he tried to find a more comfortable position. The pain had become sharper, radiating through his back and shoulders. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, but each jolt of the car on the rough roads sent waves of agony shooting up his spine. You holding up okay? Marcus asked, glancing over with concern. Tyrone forced a small nod. I'm making it, he replied, though his voice was strained. But I don't know how much more of this I can take, Marcus. Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel, his expression darkening. We'll find a way, he said, his tone determined. We've got one last pharmacy to try tonight, and if they give us trouble, well, let's just say I'm not in the mood to play nice anymore. They both knew that going to yet another pharmacy was a long shot, but it was the only option they had left. Marcus drove through winding streets until they reached a part of town known for its older shops and businesses. It was a quieter area, the kind of place where people knew each other by name, and Tyrone couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. They pulled up to the small pharmacy, its neon open sign flickering in the window. Marcus parked the car, and they both took a deep breath before heading inside. The pharmacy had a cozy, old-fashioned charm, with shelves stocked with everything from bandages to herbal teas. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with thick glasses, peering at them over the frames as they approached. "Evening, folks," he greeted them, his voice warm and friendly. "What can I do for you?" Tyrone handed him the prescription, watching carefully for any sign of hesitation or judgment. The man examined the paperwork, nodding thoughtfully as he read the details. "All right," he said, looking up with a small smile. "Give me a moment to fill this for you." Tyrone felt a rush of relief wash over him. After all the rejection and humiliation he had endured that night, it seemed like he had finally found someone who was willing to help. He exchanged a hopeful glance with Marcus, who gave him an encouraging nod. But just as the man was about to turn and prepare the medication, a door at the back of the pharmacy swung open, and a younger woman stepped out, her expression wary as she looked them over. She crossed her arms, giving the elderly man a pointed look. "Dad, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "I mean, we don't know who these people are." The older man gave her a reassuring smile. "They have a valid prescription, Emma," he replied calmly. "It's our job to help people in pain, no matter who they are." Emma's gaze flickered over Tyrone and Marcus, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I just don't want us to get into trouble," she muttered, her tone filled with suspicion. Marcus took a step forward, his expression hardening. "Trouble?" he repeated, his voice low. "What kind of trouble are you worried about?" Emma's eyes darted to her father, who held up a hand, signaling for Marcus to stay calm. "It's all right," the old man said gently. "Emma she worries, that's all." Tyrone felt a pang of disappointment as he looked at the young woman. He could see the doubt in her eyes, the same distrust he had seen countless times before. But he forced himself to stay quiet, hoping that her father's kindness would be enough to overcome her fears. The elderly man turned back to the counter, beginning to prepare the medication, but Emma remained by his side, watching them closely. Tyrone's shoulders tensed as he noticed her scrutiny, and he could feel Marcus bristling beside him. After a few minutes, the man finished preparing the prescription and placed the medication on the counter. "Here you go," he said with a gentle smile. "I hope this helps ease your pain." Tyrone reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he took the bottle, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You don't know how much this means to me." But before he could put the bottle away, Emma stepped forward, her expression tense. "Wait a minute," she said sharply. "I want to see some ID." Marcus's patience snapped. "Are you kidding me?" he demanded, his voice rising. "He already gave you the prescription from his doctor. What more do you need?" Emma crossed her arms, unfazed by Marcus's anger. "It's standard procedure," she replied coldly. "If you don't have anything to hide, there shouldn't be a problem." Tyrone took a shaky breath, pulling his ID from his wallet and handing it to her. Emma inspected it with a scrutinizing gaze, as if she were trying to find something wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she handed it back to him with a curt nod. "All right," she said stiffly. "You can go." Tyrone and Marcus exchanged a weary glance before heading for the door, But just as they were about to leave, the older man called out to them. "Wait a moment," he said, coming around the counter. They stopped, turning to face him. He looked at them with an apologetic expression, clearly uncomfortable with the way things had gone. "I'm really sorry about that," he said softly. "Please, don't take it personally. Emma's just cautious." Tyrone managed a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand," he replied. "Thank you for helping me. It means a lot." The man nodded, patting him on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice filled with genuine concern. Tyrone and Marcus finally stepped outside, the cool night air washing over them as they walked back to the car. Tyrone clutched the bottle of medication tightly, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He had finally gotten what he needed, but the journey had left him drained, both physically and emotionally. They climbed into the car, and Marcus started the engine, his expression unreadable as he pulled out of the parking lot. For a while, they drove in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Tyrone stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, glancing over at him. Tyrone nodded slowly, though he knew he wasn't truly okay. The events of the night had taken a toll on him, and he wasn't sure how he would recover from the hurt and humiliation he had experienced. "I'll be all right," he said quietly. "Thanks for standing by me, Marcus. I couldn't have done this alone." Marcus nodded, his gaze softening. "You're never alone, Tyrone. Not as long as I'm around." They continued driving, the weight of the night slowly fading as they headed toward home. But Tyrone knew that the pain of what he had endured would stay with him, a constant reminder of the battle he had fought to be treated with dignity. Welcome to Story Hub, dedicated to exposing, understanding, and discussing stories. Here we dive deep into real-life experiences. By sharing these stories, we hope to create awareness, inspire change, and encourage open dialogue. If you're passionate about building a fairer world, please join us, like, comment, and subscribe to support the community and keep up with new stories each day. The drive home was quiet, with both men absorbed in the evening's events. Marcus glanced over at Tyrone, who was finally dozing off, the pain medication finally taking effect. But Marcus's mind was racing. The way Tyrone had been treated, time after time, still fueled a simmering anger inside him. He knew he couldn't let this go. As they neared Tyrone's apartment, Marcus gently nudged him awake. "Hey, buddy, we're almost home." Tyrone stirred, rubbing his eyes and wincing slightly. "Feels like we've been out all night." He sighed, managing a weary smile as he looked over at Marcus. "Thanks for sticking by me, man. I don't know how I would have gotten through tonight without you." Marcus smiled. "You know I've got your back, always." They parked the car, and Marcus helped Tyrone up the few stairs to his apartment. Tyrone's face reflected his exhaustion, and his body visibly sagged with relief as he collapsed onto the couch. Marcus went to grab some water from the kitchen, then settled across from Tyrone, his mind still turning over the events of the night. "I don't want you to have to go through that kind of humiliation again," Marcus finally said, his voice firm. "It's not right, and I think we can do something about it." Tyrone looked up at him, eyebrows raised in surprise. "What do you mean?" "Tomorrow morning," Marcus said, leaning forward, "we're going to file a complaint against that pharmacist who refused to help you. He needs to be held accountable, and if we can get someone higher up to pay attention, maybe they'll start to rethink how they're treating people." Tyrone considered it, nodding slowly. "You're right. I've been silent about this kind of thing for too long. I just didn't think anyone would actually listen. Well, they'll have to listen this time. And if they don't, we'll make sure they do." The following morning, they made their way to the local pharmacy board's office. The waiting room was packed, but Marcus was undeterred, his gaze set and determined. Tyrone could feel his nerves jangling as they waited, but he reminded himself that he had every right to be here. When they were finally called to speak with someone, they explained the events of the previous night in detail, recounting every dismissive comment, every unnecessary hurdle thrown in Tyrone's way. The officer taking down their statement listened carefully, nodding and asking clarifying questions. Tyrone felt his confidence building as he spoke, feeling empowered by Marcus's steady presence beside him. After they finished, the officer looked at them thoughtfully. "I appreciate you coming forward with this information," she said. "We take complaints like this very seriously. Pharmacists are held to high standards, and discrimination of any kind is not tolerated." Tyrone felt a weight lift from his shoulders at her words. For the first time, he felt like someone was truly listening, like his voice mattered. Marcus placed a supportive hand on his shoulder as they left the office, his expression reflecting a mixture of satisfaction and hope. "I think we did the right thing," Marcus said as they walked outside, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the city. Tyrone nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Yeah, I think we did." With the complaint filed, they returned to Tyrone's apartment, each of them feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Tyrone finally felt like he had taken a stand, like he was no longer just a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Over the next few days, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Tyrone took his medication regularly, and the pain began to subside, allowing him to focus on other things. He spent time with his neighbors, played chess with the old-timers at the local park, and even started painting again, a hobby he hadn't indulged in for years. He found himself feeling more alive than he had in a long time. One evening, as he was packing up his painting supplies, he received a call from the pharmacy board. The voice on the other end was calm and professional as they informed him that they had reviewed his complaint and were launching an investigation into the pharmacy's practices. They assured him that they were committed to ensuring equal treatment for all patients, regardless of race or background. Tyrone thanked them, feeling a surge of relief wash over him. He knew that the investigation might not change everything overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. He called Marcus to share the news, his voice filled with a newfound optimism. "I told you, man," Marcus said with a grin. "You deserve to be treated with respect. I'm glad you didn't let them get away with this." In the days that followed, Tyrone noticed a shift in himself. He walked with his head held higher, a new sense of confidence radiating from him. He was no longer willing to accept mistreatment or discrimination without a fight, and he knew he had Marcus by his side, ready to stand with him. One afternoon, as he was walking home from the park, Tyrone saw a familiar figure standing outside his apartment building. It was Jimmy, the friend from the auto shop who had loaned them the car on that long, painful night. He was leaning against his truck, looking deep in thought as he waited for Tyrone to arrive. "Jimmy." Tyrone greeted him with a smile. "What brings you by?" Jimmy looked up, his expression serious. "I heard about what happened to you at that pharmacy," he said. "Marcus told me. It's not right, man. No one should have to go through that." Tyrone nodded, feeling a pang of gratitude. "Yeah, it wasn't easy. But we filed a complaint, and they're looking into it now. I'm hoping things will change." Jimmy's face softened, and he clapped a hand on Tyrone's shoulder. "Good. You did the right thing. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Tyrone thanked him, feeling a warmth spread through his chest at the show of support. He knew he wasn't alone, that he had people who cared about him and believed in his right to be treated fairly. It was a feeling he would hold on to, a reminder that he was stronger than any discrimination thrown his way. Later that evening, as he sat by his window, watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky, Tyrone reflected on the journey he had taken. He thought about the pain, the humiliation, and the quiet strength that had carried him through each moment of hardship. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also knew that he had the power to face them. He picked up a paintbrush, dipping it into vibrant colors as he began to create a new piece. The canvas filled with strokes of bold reds and deep blues, each brushstroke a testament to his resilience and courage. He painted with a newfound sense of freedom, knowing that his voice mattered, that he was worthy of respect. The night stretched on, filled with the quiet sounds of the city and the soft scratch of his brush on the canvas. As he painted, Tyrone felt a peace settle over him, a sense of fulfillment that came from knowing he had taken a stand, that he had fought for his dignity and his right to be treated as an equal. And in that moment, he knew that no one could ever take that away from him. Days turned into weeks, and Tyrone found his routine settling into a comfortable rhythm. Each morning, he rose early, tending to his garden and taking walks through the neighborhood. There was a new bounce in his step, a quiet resilience born from his recent experiences. He'd filed a complaint, and while it didn't erase what had happened, he knew he had taken a meaningful stand. Word of his ordeal had spread in the community, sparking conversations about fairness and respect in ways he hadn't seen before. Tyrone was glad for the support he'd received. Marcus checked in regularly, always armed with stories to make him laugh or insightful reflections that brought fresh perspectives. Jimmy, too, stopped by frequently, sharing updates from his auto shop and often bringing gifts of food or homegrown vegetables. One sunny Saturday, Tyrone was painting at his small easel by the window when Marcus arrived, a determined look on his face. "You'll never believe what I just heard," Marcus said, walking in and setting his phone on the table. Tyrone put down his brush, wiping his hands on a cloth. "What's going on?" "I just got off the phone with a friend of mine from college. He works at a civil rights organization downtown," Marcus explained. "Apparently, they're taking on cases where people have been denied service or treated unfairly due to discrimination. I told him about what happened to you, and he's interested in helping however he can." Tyrone blinked, feeling a mix of surprise and appreciation. "You think they'd be able to help with my case?" "Absolutely." He said he's seen cases like this before, and with the way it happened to you, he thinks it's worth looking into. He even suggested a meeting so you could share your story with them directly. Tyrone hesitated, a hint of uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He'd taken steps to stand up for himself, but this felt like a new level of exposure. Still, he couldn't ignore the thought that his story might help make a difference for others facing the same injustice. "All right," Tyrone finally said, nodding. "Let's set up the meeting. If this can help even one person avoid what I went through, it'll be worth it." The following week, Tyrone and Marcus arrived at the Civil Rights Organization's office. The building was a stately structure downtown, filled with bustling professionals and legal minds dedicated to fighting inequality. Tyrone felt a surge of pride as he walked inside, knowing he was about to share his story with people who could make a difference. They were shown into a small conference room, where a woman named Alana greeted them with a warm smile. Alana introduced herself as one of the organization's lead attorneys, and as she shook Tyrone's hand, he felt the steadiness of her grip and her earnestness. "Tyrone, it's a pleasure to meet you," she began. "Thank you for being willing to share what happened to you. Stories like yours are important, and the work we're doing depends on people who are brave enough to come forward." Tyrone nodded, taking a deep breath as he began recounting his experience at the pharmacy. He spoke of the pain he'd endured, the humiliation of being denied service, and the anger he'd felt at being treated with such disregard. Alana listened intently, taking notes and nodding at key points, her expression a mixture of empathy and outrage. When Tyrone finished, Alana leaned back in her chair, her eyes serious. "I've handled cases like yours before, Tyrone, and it's truly disheartening that situations like this are still happening," she said. "The way you were treated was unacceptable, and we want to support you in holding that pharmacist accountable." Tyrone glanced at Marcus, who gave him an encouraging nod. "What's the next step, then?" Tyrone asked, his voice steady. Alana explained that they would begin by filing a formal complaint with the state medical board, as well as a lawsuit against the pharmacy if needed. She detailed the legal process, outlining how they would gather evidence, interview witnesses, and build a case to demonstrate the impact of the pharmacist's actions. It would be a lengthy process, but Alana assured him they would be with him every step of the way. As they left the office, Tyrone felt a newfound sense of empowerment. He was no longer just a victim of a momentary injustice. He was now part of a larger fight for change, supported by people who believed in his right to be treated fairly. Over the following weeks, the case began to take shape. Tyrone met with Alana several times, providing additional information and sharing his story in greater detail. Each time, he felt a sense of catharsis, a release of the pain he'd carried since that night. He spoke not only for himself but for countless others who had been silenced, his words a beacon of hope and resistance. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to stand by him, offering moral support and encouragement. Jimmy joined them often, bringing stories of customers at his shop who'd expressed admiration for Tyrone's courage. The community was rallying behind him, and it became clear that his story had ignited a sense of unity and resolve among people who wanted to see justice served. One day, as Tyrone was finishing a painting in his apartment, he received a call from Alana. "We've received word from the pharmacy board," she announced, her tone filled with anticipation. "They're opening an investigation into the pharmacy's practices, including the actions of the pharmacist who refused to help you." Tyrone felt a surge of excitement. It was a significant step forward, and it meant that his voice had been heard. The board's investigation would bring a level of accountability that he hadn't thought possible, and he felt a sense of vindication knowing that others were now looking into the matter. As he hung up the phone, Tyrone reflected on how much he had grown since that night. He'd gone from feeling powerless to taking charge of his life, from being a silent sufferer to an outspoken advocate for his own dignity. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but he was prepared for whatever came next. One evening, as Tyrone and Marcus sat at the local cafe, enjoying a warm meal, Marcus looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, man, you've come a long way since that night. You're standing up for yourself in ways you didn't even know you could." Tyrone nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I've realized that I deserve respect, just like anyone else. And if speaking up can help others too, then it's all worth it." They clinked their glasses in a quiet toast, savoring the moment. Tyrone knew that he was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had been marginalized, every individual who had been denied dignity and respect. And with each step forward, he was reclaiming his power and his worth. The day of the hearing finally arrived. Tyrone had prepared himself for this moment, gathering his strength and resolve with every step that had led him here. He'd been through hours of interviews, submitted mountains of evidence, and spent sleepless nights replaying the events in his mind. But today, he stood taller, a man who had transformed his pain into a powerful force for justice. Marcus and Jimmy joined him as he entered the courthouse, offering quiet words of encouragement and solidarity. Tyrone wore a tailored suit that Marcus had gifted him, the sharp lines and rich fabric lending him a feeling of confidence. Alana was waiting for them at the entrance, her briefcase in hand and her expression resolute. "You ready?" she asked, her gaze searching his face for any hesitation. Tyrone nodded firmly. "I'm ready." They entered the hearing room, a formal space with rows of seats and a long table where the pharmacy board's representatives sat. Across from them was the pharmacist, flanked by his legal team, his face set in an expression of thinly veiled contempt. Tyrone felt a flare of anger but quickly calmed himself, drawing strength from the steady presence of Marcus and Jimmy beside him. The hearing began, with Alana presenting Tyrone's case with a calm yet passionate determination. She recounted the events of that painful night, describing how the pharmacist had refused to fulfill Tyrone's prescription, dismissed him with disdain, and ignored his pleas for relief. Tyrone could see the board members' expressions shift as they listened, some looking genuinely disturbed by the story unfolding before them. The pharmacist's lawyer tried to defend his actions, claiming there was a misunderstanding, that Tyrone had been uncooperative, and that protocol had been followed. Tyrone clenched his fists, barely able to contain his frustration as he listened to the attempt to twist the facts. But Alana was prepared, countering each argument with evidence and carefully pointing out the inconsistencies in the pharmacist's statements. When it was Tyrone's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and rose to his feet, meeting the board members' eyes one by one. He shared his experience in his own words, describing the physical pain he'd endured, the humiliation of being denied basic care, and the emotional toll of being treated as though his suffering didn't matter. His voice was steady, but there was a fierce passion in his tone, an unshakable conviction that resonated in the quiet room. As he spoke, Tyrone noticed the expressions of the board members softening, their eyes filled with a mix of empathy and outrage. He could feel his words connecting with them, reaching into the core of their humanity. When he finished, there was a heavy silence, a moment of collective reflection on the injustice he had endured. After hours of testimonies and deliberations, the board members reconvened. The head of the board, an older man with silver hair and a solemn expression, addressed the room. He began by commending Tyrone for his courage and resilience, acknowledging the pain he had suffered and the strength he had shown in coming forward. "It is our duty to ensure that all individuals are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, background, or circumstances," he said, his voice carrying a note of sincerity that resonated with everyone present. "The evidence presented today leaves us with no doubt that Mr. Wilson's treatment was not only unjust but in direct violation of the ethical standards we uphold." With those words, the board issued its decision. The pharmacist would be suspended pending further investigation, and the pharmacy itself would be required to undergo a thorough review of its policies to prevent any future occurrences of discrimination. Tyrone felt a surge of relief wash over him, a weight lifting from his shoulders as he realized that justice, in its own way, had been served. Marcus clapped him on the back, his face lit with a wide grin. Jimmy cheered quietly beside him, pumping his fist in victory. Alana offered a warm handshake, her eyes shining with pride. Tyrone felt a profound sense of gratitude for the people who had stood by him, who had believed in him when he'd struggled to believe in himself. As they left the courthouse, Tyrone took a deep breath of the crisp evening air, savoring the taste of freedom and vindication. The city lights twinkled around them, and he felt a newfound lightness in his step, a sense of triumph that resonated in every fiber of his being. The next few days were filled with celebrations and quiet reflections. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate him, sharing their own stories of resilience and survival. Tyrone listened with an open heart, knowing that his fight had become part of a larger tapestry of voices striving for justice and equality. He had taken a stand not only for himself but for everyone who had ever been marginalized, silenced, or disregarded. One evening, Marcus and Jimmy joined him for dinner, and as they laughed and reminisced, Tyrone felt a deep sense of gratitude for the friendships that had sustained him. They toasted to the future, to new beginnings, and to the unwavering power of standing up for one's worth. As the night wore on, Tyrone found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken. He knew that life would continue to present challenges, that prejudice and injustice still existed in the world. But he also knew that he had the strength to face whatever came his way, armed with the knowledge that he was deserving of respect, compassion, and dignity. He returned to his apartment, gazing out at the city skyline with a sense of peace and fulfillment. His journey had been painful, but it had also revealed the depth of his resilience, the power of his voice, and the strength of his spirit. And in that quiet moment, he felt a profound sense of belonging, a deep connection to the world around him, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of change.